It was a place of prayer and a place of mass murder, a crossroads of battle and siege for over 300 years. And it isn't the Alamo. Unlike the former mission-turned-fortress in San Antonio, the Presidio La Bahia in Goliad was built with military intentions. She was constructed for battle, for the fight, for the sound of cannon and musket fire, for the warning peal of the church bells and flags waving proudly over the battlements. It is ironic, then, that La Bahia's mark on history is not a legacy of a battle, but of execution. In February of 2015, my father and I went to look for the ghosts of over 300 Texian victims and their commander during a long night at La Bahia. South and east of San Antonio lies the town of Goliad, home to the Presidio Nuestra Señora de Loreto de la Bahia, built by the Spanish in 1747 as a fortress on the Texas Coast Road. Today, Presidio La Bahia has been rebuilt to its 1836 appearance, although the fort's chapel, which continues to hold Catholic services every Sunday, is original and was offering a place of faith to the faithful decades before Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams met in Philadelphia to pen the Declaration of Independence. Today, the Presidio houses a functioning chapel, a museum, reenactment and living history events, and a single suite of rooms that could be rented for overnight visits. It was this suite of rooms, known as the quarters, that my parents booked for me as a Christmas gift, and it was this suite that my father and I were going to spend a Saturday night in, doing our best to investigate the history and ghostly past of La Bahia. We woke early that Saturday, leaving our family's homestead and taking the 3-hour drive south towards the Texas coastal plains. Our first visit, however, wasn't going to be in Goliad. Instead, we were going to head to a lonely spot on the prairie about 15 miles further, where the true story of the Goliad Massacre begins. Although the gate says Fannin Battlefield, the conflict that took place here was known as the Battle of Coleto Creek. To understand what this small, rather barren field means to Texas, you have to understand who Colonel James Walker Fannin was and why he and his men wound up surrounded by Mexican soldiers in this place in March of 1836. The Texas Revolution had been anything but a clean, organized, and clearly led revolt against the tyrannical rule of Generalissimo Santa Anna. Several Texas military men led groups of troops and volunteers in different key areas of Texas, each believing that they, in fact, were the ultimate commander-in-chief. One of those men was Colonel Fannin, stationed at Goliad's Presidio La Bahia with one of the largest contingents of Texas rebels, more than double the number of troops present at the Alamo. A West Point dropout, Fannin was considered a military expert, but he had one fatal flaw: indecision. When he heard Mexican troops were surging towards Goliad, his troops, encumbered with wagons and supplies, only abandoned the Presidio when Mexican outriders were spotted in the town of Goliad itself. From that point, the endgame was preordained: a dash for the protected timber of Coleto Creek, cut off by Mexican dragoons, and then a day and night battle surrounded on all sides in the middle of an open prairie. Today, Coleto Creek is a fenced-in area with a small walk-through museum. The spot where the Texans under Fannin formed up in a tight square, a formation more reminiscent of Napoleonic battlefields in Europe, is marked by a rusting piece of farm equipment planted by the former owner of this land. It was here, surrounded by Mexican infantry, dragoons, and artillery, with nowhere to hide, that Fannin decided to offer an honorable surrender. It was accepted, and the men were led back to Goliad and the Presidio La Bahia to await the decision of Santa Anna. With the wounded imprisoned in the Presidio's chapel, the Mexican commander, General Jose Urrea, uneasily waited as well. He knew that Santa Anna had declared all Texian rebels as pirates and criminals, not soldiers, to be summarily executed, a threat carried out with a vengeance at the Alamo. On Palm Sunday, March 27, 1836, the prisoners were marched in 3 columns into the Texas countryside. Less than a mile away from the fortress, the Mexican soldiers halted the column and then formed a firing squad. They opened fire on the unarmed prisoners. Today, those 3 sites aren't even marked by a roadside historical plaque. It takes some research and some Google Map searching to pinpoint the approximate locations where historians and archaeologists suspect each column faced the rifles of their executioners. Today, they are just fields, forgotten, unmarked, and unsung. In a way, they must appear almost as they did in 1836, when the men under Fannin's command were murdered along the road. 28 would escape, feigning death under the bodies of their friends. For them, the horror of Goliad was over. For the 40 Texians who had been wounded at the Battle of Coleto Creek and were unable to walk, left in the small confines of the Presidio's chapel, the horror of that Palm Sunday had yet to begin. Checking in at the Presidio, my father and I investigated the lay of the land, quite literally. The fortress included a curtain wall that enclosed a parade ground, which in 1836 had been filled with the tents of Texian troops, and, in 2015, actually included the tents of several reenactors who would be spending the night in the Presidio, living the life of our Texian ancestors. One wall was devoted to a small barracks. A second was devoted to officers' quarters and storage. The same set of buildings included the museum today. In one corner, the chapel had its own enclosed courtyard, and it is in this courtyard that our quarters are located. A suite of rooms of thick stone walls, leather furniture, and with a window that looks out into the chapel's courtyard, the site of death and murder on a large scale. Before night fell, we ventured out into the courtyard to converse with the Texian reenactors who were sharing the compound with us that night. History teachers and frontier aficionados, these very welcoming folk invited us to sit and chat with them, and chat we did. It was midnight before we left the cantina tent, heading out for the true business of the evening, trying to see if the Presidio was as haunted as stories suggested. Behind most stories was the chapel courtyard, the small, enclosed area in front of the chapel doors where Mexican soldiers executed the 40 Texian soldiers who had been too injured to join the 3 columns of prisoners that had left the Presidio that morning. At night, the area is lit by an orange floodlight, and when you are staying in the quarters and have the whole compound to yourself, it is all too easy to imagine the ghost of that Palm Sunday still waiting in that courtyard. The 40 remaining Texians in the chapel must have known what awaited them. Then the guards came in and escorted them in batches into the courtyard. Group by group, shots rang out. The man who was arguably most responsible for the presence in that courtyard was executed last, James Fannin. Not quite 200 years later, I walked out into that courtyard, sat near the water gate, and was blindfolded. I wanted to see what I felt. I wanted to see if perhaps I could have some sense of what it was like to be Colonel Fannin in that moment. The moment the blindfold covered my eyes, I felt a chill that needed no supernatural cause. We saw and heard no ghosts that night, but I did spend some time by myself on the ramparts talking to Colonel Fannin. His decisions, or lack of them, puzzled me. I didn't understand them, and I wanted answers. There was no answer, but the wind in the trees that grew alongside the walls. But a picture I took that night did bring up something unexplainable. I had never had an issue with a single picture taken with my iPhone's camera before or since, but that night, as I questioned Fannin about how he felt about his decisions, I took a picture of the Presidio's chapel that turned out distinctly odd. The top of the chapel seemed to have been caught mid-collapse, and the bell tower was mysteriously missing. I can't explain the picture's appearance or its distortion, but on a night filled trying to talk with ghosts, its presence seemed oddly appropriate. The next day, we left La Bahia behind after a night spent chasing ghosts and exploring the history of that fascinating place. Like so many others, we left our names and stories in the quarters guest book. I read through them, seeing encounters with wailing spirits, mysterious cannon blasts, and shaking doors. I could only add that we had spent a long night within the walls of La Bahia.